Welcome everyone to the first Mountain Voices presentation of the 2021 and 2022 academic year. We're very happy you're here. I'm Marcia Schmidt-Blaine. I'm a professor emerita of history from Plymouth State. Let me introduce tonight's speaker, Lourdes Sevilla. Lourdes is a professor of meteorology. She's also the director of the Computational, Applied, Mathematical, and Physical Sciences academic unit at Plymouth State. She is the organizational head of the Meteorology, Physics, Mathematics, and Climate Studies programs on campus and a trustee of the National University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. You can tell she is an accomplished woman. I want to mention something that I know she's very proud about, and I think it's awesome that she won this award. The university awarded her with the well-deserved Excellence in Service in 2020. She's currently working on a textbook about science, history, and societal aspects of atmospheric optics. These are things like rainbows, blue skies, and many other optic effects in the sky. Her research on hurricanes, however, brought us all together. In this case, she's combining science and history and, of course, meteorology. She published her book, The Great New England Hurricane of 1938, about 2013. Yeah. I'm sure she'll answer. Good, 2013.
The first edition, yeah.
Her talk tonight is an outgrowth of that. During the talk, if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and Rebecca will share them with Lourdes at the end of the presentation. A warm welcome to you, Lourdes, and thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody, and thank you to the folks at the Museum of the White Mountains for inviting me to talk to you tonight. I am going to share my screen and load my presentation, which usually takes a moment, and then we'll get started. I will tell you more about where the title came from, but I decided to call it The Great Blowdown, the science and history of the Great New England Hurricane and its effects on the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And I prepared a presentation that highlights the effects on the White Mountains besides other aspects that I normally cover of the science and the history of the storm. So before we go into the specifics of the Great New England Hurricane, I wanted to mention a little bit. Everybody knows that hurricanes affect the Gulf Coast and the southern part of the East Coast and Florida especially. But New England is not affected by hurricanes as much as they are. However, we do experience the remnants of hurricanes like general storminess or sometimes a lot of rain every year or two. About every 3 or so decades, it has been quite a few since 1991. We do get the landfall of a Category 1 hurricane, which is a minimum hurricane. That was Hurricane Bob in 1991. We get major hurricanes, which are Category 3 or higher, about every half century or so. The last one was Hurricane Carol in 1954, so it's been a while. And then there are the big ones, the ones that not only have the strength of a Category 3 or higher, but also cause very widespread devastation everywhere in New England or throughout most of New England. And since historical times, since the colonial times, there have been 3 of those, the ones that I like to call the big ones. We had the Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635. We had the Great Gale of 1815. And finally, we had the Great New England Hurricane of 1938, which is the subject of our talk tonight. And this hurricane is the one to which all New England hurricanes are sooner or later compared. Not only did it cause a lot of devastation everywhere in the area, including Long Island and Quebec and the entire New England region, but is the one that happened the most recently. after we already had more communication like radio, lots of newspaper, and photography, for example, did not exist in 1815 and certainly not in 1635. So it's a lot better documented. So it was the subject of my research for more than 10 years, and I probably will never be done with it. I keep uncovering things and things keep coming my way about it. But the idea I had was to do an interdisciplinary study. Once I became interested in the storm, I realized it was very rich, not just scientifically in terms of the meteorology and other normal hurricane things like hydrology, the geology, the geological effects, and in our case, forest ecology, but also societal aspects like the cost, health issues, the immense amount of recovery that had to occur, and also the emergency management practices that had not been developed very well yet. FEMA didn't exist. So many of the things we do today happened for the first time back after this hurricane occurred. And then the historical aspects. What was life like in the 1930s? What was happening politically and socially? The history of hurricane science, how we learned about storms and how they work. The history of the Weather Service, how they formed and how the hurricane forecasting was done then versus how it's done now. Also, weather observations and weather instrumentation, the history of how it was done and how it compares to now. So it was very, very rich, and I'm actually very spoiled. Anytime I look at any other weather event these days, it's never as good as this one. In the process, I reviewed hundreds of documents, official reports of all sorts. All agencies put out very quickly reports like the Red Cross, the National Hurricane Service, not the National Hurricane, the National Weather Bureau, the National Geological Survey. There were special reports, the Forest Service, there were all sorts of diaries, pictures, summaries, letters, so much to review. And that gave me a very rich understanding of not just the science, but what it would have been like to live through this storm. So today I will want to tell you about the storm itself, and in the process give you a little bit of hurricane science. I will tell you about the effects of the storm as it hit southern and northern New England. And I will focus a little bit on, a little more on what happened in northern New England, especially in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and tell you about what the hurricane left behind, what its legacy was. There is so much that I could talk to you about, and I usually joke that I could talk for 10 hours, but I will not do that. I set up an alarm for 45 minutes after 7 so that if I'm going long, I realize it, as opposed to keep talking to you about this topic that is so fascinating to me. Some of the slides I've shown so far have, let me turn on my laser pointer here, have this hurricane image here. The Weather Bureau since 1871 has been putting together a summary of the weather for every single day. And you know that the detail and the style changes over the years. This is how it looked back in 1938. And it has a lot of information. It has what the weather looked like. It has weather observations on the right. It has observations from the previous day, the forecast for the next day, a lot of information. And that was actually very helpful for me to understand what was going on. So it was a Wednesday, September 21st, 1938. Most of the summer dwellers were gone, and mostly the year-long residents are the ones that remained. People went about their business. People were paying attention to the radio to hear about the political situation in Europe. This was a year before World War II. happened or started, but the events that led to World War II had just begun happening in Europe. So if there would have been 24-hour cable news, this is what would have been in there. So nobody was paying attention to what was happening here, but they were paying more attention to what was happening in Europe. It had been very rainy for most of the summer, and the previous week it had rained a lot. And there were some news of some storm in Florida that, nobody paid much attention to, because hurricanes were things that happened down there in Florida. So little did they know that before the end the end of the day came, hundreds of people were going to be dead. The best estimate we have is 682 fatalities, including the entire region from Long Island through Quebec. And up to that point, it was the costliest storm of all time. If you adjust for inflation, it is $6 to $10 billion in 2021 money. But if you also adjust for population and wealth, it would probably be more than $50 billion in costs if this storm occurred today. The devastation was everywhere. It was widespread everywhere in the region: New Hampshire, Maine, Quebec, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Long Island, everywhere. And everything was affected. Buildings, infrastructure, the coast, the topography even was affected, the crops, animals, the forest definitely, and we'll talk a lot more about that. This was truly a once-a-century storm, like any of us have ever seen, and hopefully will not see, because frankly we cannot imagine the devastation that happened. Before we focus on New England, though, I want to take you back to the beginning of the storm and give you a little bit about the life cycle, and in the process give you a little bit of hurricane science. So the first sign we had that there was anything was a disturbance that was detected in the southern part of the Sahara Desert. There was a French weather station there, and this was nothing to think of. Those occur many times every summer. But tracking back, this was the storm back in September 4th that later formed the hurricane. And then this same disturbance was detected on September 10th in the Cape Verde Islands, which are right here. So this was what we call a Cape Verde hurricane. At that point, it had turned into a storm already and was intensifying and developing. However, we could not see it. It was not until the 1960s when we finally had satellites that could see hurricanes. And it was not until 1980 that we finally had satellites that could see the entire world. So most of the time, the analysis of the track of the storms was done afterward from information from weather stations and ships and things like that. But if we could see the hurricane, it would have looked a little bit like Hurricane Bill in 2009. I'm going to let it restart, which came from the east as it intensified, and then it recurved as it got closer to the US. And it probably would have looked very similar to what Hurricane Bill looks right there. But again, we had no idea this storm was there or was coming. The first time that it was observed was by a ship, a steamship, the Alegrete, which was a Brazilian cargo ship that did weather observations as part of its agreement with the Weather Bureau. And they found themselves in the center of the hurricane. And they did not radio the information right away, but they were the first ones to observe it. The Alegrete had kind of a tragic history. It was downed and sunk during World War to by friendly fire, unfortunately. So all the information I had, that's the only picture I could find of it. But I was looking into Portuguese language Wikipedia pages and rec sites in order to find information about it. So the ships at sea, the ones that could, would report the weather. Some of them radioed back the information. Others would just mail it to the Weather Bureau when they got back to shore. And you can tell a very surprising amount of information from ship observations. For example, from the observations of the Alegrete, which were that the winds were east-northeast, then east-southeast. That told me that the Alegrete probably was following a path on the northern wall of the eye wall, part of the eye wall. The problem with ship observations is that as soon as they start happening, the ships that encounter the storms are because they unfortunately found themselves in the path of the storm. So as other ships start hearing that there is a hurricane, they get out of the way, right? They don't go to where this hurricane is. So at first you get a lot of information, but then you start getting less and less and less information as there are less and less ships providing this information. And this happened with the storm, that at first we knew exactly where it was, but as it was getting closer to the US, we kind of lost track of it a little bit. We had a general idea of where it was, but not very well. Back in 1938, there was no National Hurricane Center that would not get formed until 1955, after a especially devastating New England hurricane season, by the way. The process they had in place back then was that they, depending on where the storm was the office that would be in charge of forecasting. So when we first learned about the hurricane, it was in the Jacksonville, Florida jurisdiction. So the people in Jacksonville were the ones that were keeping track of it and doing the forecast and all that as it moved closer to land. And so the storm continued moving and intensifying. And for a moment, it looked like it might go toward Florida. And obviously that wouldn't be good. At that time, when it was very strong, here's a picture of Hurricane Bill, our friend Bill from earlier. This is more or less what the storm would have looked like at this time. Florida, of course, took it very seriously because just 3 years earlier, not only did they get a lot of storms, but just 3 years earlier, they experienced one of the most intense hurricanes that has ever made landfall in the United States, which was the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, where many died, and that's a whole different story on its own. So the Red Cross headed to Florida, all the resources headed to Florida. But then it became clear that the storm started recurving as it was intensifying even more when it was close to the Bahamas. And it reached Category 5 intensity from everything that we can figure out. On September 20th, which was the day before the hurricane made landfall in New England, there was a little story hidden in the New York Times that said, as thousands of relieved residents in South Florida took down barricades, which they had nailed to windows and houses. And they expressed that predicted gradual turn to the north and northeast would take it into the transatlantic shipping lanes. So getting back to our friend Bill here from 2009, they expected the storm would do the same thing. Turn to the north and then northeast and miss the US altogether, like many of these storms did. So then the hurricane crossed the line, the 35-degree north line near Cape Hatteras, when it became under the jurisdiction of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was the headquarters of the Weather Bureau, and they had a lot less experience with hurricanes, but they had very experienced forecasters. This is how it might have looked. This is a picture of that office, but from 1926. A bunch of guys in suits working on architect desks, gathering the weather the weather data and drawing maps so that their boss, who was the chief forecaster, would put out the forecast that needed to go out very early in the morning so that it would make the newspapers. There are reports, it's a whole interesting story for another day, but there was a rookie forecaster that realized the storm was coming northward toward New England, but he didn't know how fast it was doing it. But he was told by his superiors that hurricanes avoid New England, and they were not, they were on the right to think that for various reasons. When you look at the general circulation of the atmosphere, it actually steers the hurricanes to recurve. Sometimes they take longer to recurve and they hit the Gulf or Florida. Sometimes they go into the North Atlantic like they expected this one would do. Sometimes they turn right away. But most of the time, they do not go straight toward New England. Not only that, but here's a map of sea surface temperature, and you can see the Gulf Stream here, very, very warm. So when hurricanes get past this area, they hit very cold waters that are not very good for hurricane maintenance and strengthening. Not only that, but the last time a major hurricane had hit New England was in 1869, which was a year before the establishment of the agency that later became the Weather Bureau and the National Weather Service. So even if you had been working for the Weather Service for 70 years, or almost 70 years, you would have never seen a major hurricane hit New England. So I guess we really can't blame them. And they didn't have a lot of data to see what was happening. So I titled one of my chapters, "It Doesn't Happen in New England." And it's funny because I found this little report from, it's just a collection of pictures that is titled, "It Did Happen Here," almost like if it was answering the question that if it can happen here. So some of you might have heard that this storm is called the Long Island Express by some. It's not my preferred name because it gives the impression that it only affected Long Island. But the reason for it is the Long Island Express was a train, right? And this storm was moving forward very, very, very fast, much faster than hurricanes normally do. And the reason was that the jet stream, which was very strong, was steering the storm northward and very fast, so that forward motion was mixed with the rotating of the winds, and that would make the wind, that not just the motion of the storm very fast, but also the winds on the right side of the storm much stronger than they would have been. So so that's why, even though it's not my preferred name, some people call it the Long Island Express. This is an animation of the analysis maps that I found in a paper that was written a year later. It turns out by the same rookie forecaster that forecasted the storm was coming northward. But again, that's a story for another day. So I took all the analysis maps and I just made them an animated GIF so that you could see the storm moving. One of the interesting things is that the symbols for fronts had not been settled yet. So there's a cold front and a warm front marked in there, but they don't use the normal symbols that we're used to for cold fronts and warm fronts. So then the storm made landfall in Long Island with the strength of a Category 3 hurricane. It crossed the Long Island Sound and then it made landfall in New Haven, Connecticut. The problem with the timing of the landfall is that it was the worst possible case scenario. It made landfall with the strength of a Category 3 hurricane, so with the strength of a major hurricane, But at the same time, it was transitioning into what we call an extratropical cyclone. And extratropical cyclones tend to be weaker, so it was weakening, but they are much bigger than hurricanes. So where a smaller storm, very strong but smaller storm like Carol only affected a certain area in Rhode Island and vicinity, a storm like this one grows into a very large storm that affects the entire region. This is a map drawn also from an article from 1939, the year after, showing where the winds were, and they were everywhere. Here you can see New Hampshire more or less in there. And the path of the storm can be deceiving because it went through Long Island and then made landfall in Connecticut. But that's just the center of the storm. It was affecting everywhere. Its winds and its rain were affecting everywhere. So the storm came and nobody knew it was coming, not even the Weather Bureau. They might have not realized late, but not in time to tell people. So people were in the streets. It turns out that that day it was not raining like it had been the whole previous week. And people were caught off guard doing, some of them were on the beach or going to the theater, just doing normal things that you would do in the middle of a week. But then the winds started roaring, especially on the coast, and became deafening. And the roofs started to go and steeples started to fall. And a very large storm surge came into the coastal regions, and people spoke of what looked like a fog in the distance, but it was not a fog, it was a wall of water that was coming inland. So I found this picture there is not in New England, it's in New York City, and it was part of a wonderful book put together by the National Writers Project, which was part of the Works Progress Administration. And they put together this wonderful book where not only did they have a lot of pictures and reporting of the damages throughout the region, but their descriptions were kind of poetic, or not what you would expect when somebody is reporting what's happening. For example, the text that accompanied the picture of the umbrellas turning around is, it says, let's see, where is it? Manhattan pedestrians held onto their hats. The storm had hit Broadway. And then talk about fighting to manipulate their umbrellas. And as they knew nothing of the tropical hurricane racing over their heads toward the New England states. So here's some pictures also from that book, which was the report, of many steeples, so many steeples all around the region that were broken, fallen, and even some of them came in through the roof. And I like to joke when I give these presentations that going to church was not a good idea during the storm. Down here is a picture of that book with all the wonderful pictures and reports of the storm written by the Writers Project. So the damages depended on where you were. If you were in a coastal region like Long Island and southern New England, you would experience the Category 3 hurricane winds, and you would experience the storm surge, a very large storm surge. And this is where most of the fatalities occurred. And if you were in interior New England, northern New England, then it was river flooding, it was tree damage, massive tree damage, landslides, and everywhere we had roads, bridges, dams that were washed out, infrastructure, power lines, telephone lines were torn, and most of the towns lost their shade trees. So it was not just in the forest, but also any trees planted. So for our purposes, we are going to focus more. I'll tell you a little bit about the coastal area, but we're going to focus more on the interior New England effects. Go back to my laser. So these pictures are right on Rhode Island, and what you see is the effects of the storm surge. Here's a picture by the beach. There's some structures. Here's a little pier, and down here is the same place, maybe a different time, different tide, but here is the same pier. Everything was gone. Buildings were taken down, and in many of the reports I found, it said that it took the beaches back to their pristine state, which is kind of a little misleading, because yes, it was clean here, but all of that wreckage was somewhere back here. So it was shocking, the amount of damage on the coastal region, mostly because of the weight of the water. This is in downtown Providence, where the entire town was under several feet of water, up to 25 feet in some places. And I found some interesting reports of the car horns being short-circuited and all going off at the same time. And this is after the winds and the waves had calmed down. But if you imagine the horns going off, the roaring winds, the really huge waves, all would have been extremely chaotic and scary. This is on the side of a 1773 marketplace building, where they had put a marker for the 1815 hurricane and marked where the water came. So immediately somebody made a sign with where the water came for 1938. It was a couple of feet higher for 1938. And to this day, you can find the actual marker that was added there, where the height of the storm for the two storms is put together. It took me some digging to figure out what building this was, but it turns out to be right on Canal Street, and is owned by the Rhode Island School of Design now. So it's not called 1700s Market House anymore. If another storm came like this one, and like Carol later, which was not as devastating as this one everywhere else, but it was very devastating in Rhode Island as well, it probably will not cause the amount of flooding, because a new structure has been put in place. Is the Fox Point Hurricane Barrier. It was built in 1960 and it was finished in 1966, and there have been no major hurricane landfalls since then, so we haven't been able to test it out fully. The strength of the water also caused major erosion. As you probably know, the entire southern part of Long Island and parts of the southern coast of Rhode Island have barrier beaches that are very popular to have very expensive homes in there. So some of them were breached, and to the point that some of them are still breached. And actually the Shinnecock Inlet, oh, I took it out. The Shinnecock Inlet right here has been dredged to keep open so that people have access between the open sea and the Bay Area. And it's been controversial and all sorts of small town politics. And this is a picture in the southern tip of Manhattan. And you can see the waves. These were 20 to 30 foot waves hitting the Battery Park area. The weight of the water was so strong that it literally shook the ground, and it was detectable in seismographs. This one is from New York City, but there were reports all the way to Alaska of seismographs picking up the weight of the water hitting the ground. And because of that, there's this one book called A Wind to Shake the World, referring to that. So there have been several books about this storm. Most of them focus on witness accounts and the stories of people that lived through the storm. And then they try to talk about the science a little bit on the side. So my book is the opposite. I talk about the science and the history, and I use the witness accounts to inform what was happening. So it's kind of the flip side of the other books that are out there. So the storm made it to northern New England, the interior New England area that evening from 6 to 7 p.m. And it was a very stormy evening. It was not as bad as it was down south, where most of the deaths occurred, mostly in Rhode Island. But it had been raining a lot, and this put extra rain, anywhere from 1 to 5 inches extra, causing some parts of the area to get a total of more than 15 inches of rain, which is a lot. Half an inch of rain is a lot. So more than 15 is definitely a lot. One of my students took one of those reports that I found, the 500-page geological survey hydrological report, and she plotted the information as part of her master's thesis. So I was able to add that to the second edition of the book. And then the other really bad thing that happened in this area was the tree damage. And I'll show you more about that in a second. Almost every town library has a book of the history, at least here in New England, a book of the history of their town, and in every single one of them, you will have a page or two about this hurricane. So the one from Plymouth, it's called 20 Decades, Plymouth, New Hampshire, and then there's an update after that one. But you can find, let's see, you can find a page in there that talks about the storm, and it says, when morning dawned, the havoc was too astonishing. Every street was blocked by its shade trees. The forests were a tangle of broken, uprooted, and topless logs. While it seemed unbelievable, a salt spray covered everything, mingled with finely ground leaves that dried to a crust that demanded scrubbing to remove from walls and windows. Electric wires were tangled among the fallen poles. So everything was, all the trees, many trees were fallen. And there was salt. The ocean is 100 miles away, maybe more. And there was salt that was getting mixed with ground leaves to get this greenish crust that was covering everything. And we're talking Plymouth, New Hampshire, so right here in town. But the same was true everywhere else in New Hampshire. That picture was provided to me by the Plymouth Historical Society. Those of you that are from the area might or might not recognize, but this building here is where Thai Smile is. And this area on the left side is the lawn, is where Silver Center for the Arts would be. This church burned, I believe, in 1944, so it's not there anymore. And oh, there's the bigger picture. So this is from the New Hampshire Historical Society, Route 25. So Tenny Mountain Highway, more or less, where the Walmart is, but past toward Romney. I always find it very interesting because all the cars look the same, but basically it was flooded. And the guy looked very proud on his car there, posing for the picture. So the massive tree blowdown really is the biggest story in northern New England, especially in New Hampshire, because the ground was so wet, it could not hold the tree roots very well. So the winds knocked down so many trees. And even though the winds were not as strong as when the landfall happened further south, it was enough to knock the trees down. The report of the amount of trees that went down was unfortunately not done in the number of trees. It was actually done in board feet of timber, which is a 1-inch by 12-inch by 12-inch square of usable timber. So that kind of gives you the idea that they were thinking of the trees down as wood rather than as trees. I did a very rough calculation that told me that it was tens to maybe hundreds of millions of trees down. And there were 15 million acres in the entire New England region that had the tree damage. So what followed was a massive salvage and cleanup operation. The southwest part of the state, the Keene area, was especially hit because white pines fell a lot. And the Forest Service did a survey of the tree damage. I focused on New Hampshire here. And the colors tell you where there was more tree damage. They measured it in terms of fire hazard. If you put a map of New Hampshire right next to it, it gives you the impression that the White Mountains were not affected much. But this is not true. What happened is that they were not allowed to salvage timber from the White Mountains forest and from some other state parks. So they didn't even bother checking to see how many trees were down in those areas. The trees actually were what were in people's minds the most. Besides the death that occurred in southern New England, it was the loss of trees that really hit people really hard. I found a quote that unfortunately I didn't save for where it was published, but it said, "Our foliage friends had been slain, and many hearts are sad." This is a poem from a third grader that says, "The wind did blow, the trees bent low, the leaves flew away from the wind's rough play." And here's a little song that says, "The wind was oh so very bold, the earth the trees just could not hold, the river in its mighty wrath took everything within its path." And there were just trees down everywhere. I found pictures that are not identified, but they are in the Plymouth State College then, Teachers College. There were students posing next to the trees that went down. And in one of the presentations I gave, one of the attendees sent me this picture of somebody in their family had it, kids just playing on the fallen trees. If you've been to the Flume Gorge, there is a footbridge, the Sentinel Pine Bridge, that the base support log there is what used to be a more than 100-foot tall pine tree called the Sentinel pine tree that was about 5 feet wide and got knocked down by the hurricane. The picture on the right is somebody sent this to me.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Ah, Siri thinks I want to talk to it. And people just send me pictures of things that they think I'm interested in. And this is a more recent picture of the Sentinel Pine Bridge. It's in the Flume Gorge Trail. There were trees, so many trees that they could not process them all fast enough. And many of the soft woods were actually thrown inside ponds because they would get damaged with the elements and insects and things like that. So to save them, they put them in ponds. And Turkey Pond received more than 12 million trees. Turkey Pond is to the southwest of Concord, New Hampshire. And there's a very cool story about a mill that was set up in the northern part of the lake that was fully operated by women. And there's a historical marker there, which is historical marker number 184. It's right by Turkey Pond and talks about the women that worked the sawmill. And a lady from UNH wrote a small book a few years ago. And during one of the presentations I gave, a woman told me that she could see these logs coming up and down in a pond in the property her family owned. And she actually sent me a picture of one of them and the marking that the trunk had. I wish to see one of these someday, but I haven't. So there is a book out there.
Sorry, could you say that again?
There's a book out there written by Mr. Stephen Long, who came to talk to me to learn about the history of the storm, and I talked to him to learn about the forest. So he was kind enough to feature me and my book in his book, which came out a few years after mine. So I know that I'm running into the 45 minutes that you told me, but if you let me talk about the effects on the river, I would like to take a few more minutes to do that. So this is done with the data that my student grabbed from that very, very large report. It's 500 pages long. And this is the river height at the Pemmy River in Plymouth, where there is a gauge of the river height. There's information everywhere else, so that this graph was also made by my student, by a different student, of the Connecticut River heights. So when the storm came, the river was already over flood stage because it had been raining so much. So the storm came in the 21st and was moving very fast. So it left very quickly, but it toppled over the flood. And it is kind of overgrown right now, but about 10 years ago, I went there with my family. My kids, who are college kids right now, were little, and one of them wanted to pose for me. So the water came up to 23.6 feet. So it would have covered Chris completely. And the whole area in the the exit 25 and the bridge and all that.
Could you say that again?
Oh my gosh. It would have been covered by water. And if you've seen the Citgo station in Route 175 in Holderness, there are marks on the wall where the river came in. And the highest there is from 87, because the gas station does not go as far back. But the hurricane would have been a couple of inches higher than that. So back in 2013, when it was the 75th anniversary of the hurricane, and when my book came out, I also prepared an exhibit for the Museum of the White Mountains, which we call the Great Blowdown. I focused on the flooding and the tree damage in northern New England. It's a 16-panel exhibit. There's all the panels there. And it lived in the basement of the Mount Washington Observatory Weather Discovery Center, which unfortunately closed last year. But they were kind enough to give me the panels back. So I'll be happy to give them back to the museum if you want them. But the exhibit is available online if anybody wants to check it out. It's little blurbs of different aspects of the hurricane. So the storm dissipated over Canada the next day, and there's so much more. There was the Cog Railway was damaged by the storm. The notches were blocked. As I mentioned before, bridges, dams were washed out. There were landslides everywhere. And the report from the Mount Washington Observatory observer, let's see, I have it here. It says, violent winds continued with lessening force throughout the night. Many trees were blown down on all sides of the mountain, and the carriage road, not the auto road, closed by fallen trees. New slides around the ravines that were surrounding the mountain, and the railroad trestle ripped off from below the skyline. So the Cog Railway was damaged all the way through here, especially in that very steep part that we know as Jacob's Ladder. And there's a whole history about how that got fixed and how that ended up making it so that Dartmouth College owned the top of the mountain, and then the state could buy it from them. And it all was because of the hurricane. So let me get off my presentation and look ahead to make sure that I show you any, discard my markings. Give me a second, it should come back. And I have a lot more because I always have a lot more. But what you should think about is that when the storm occurred, that was September 21st, and what was about to happen in New England, as it does every year, is the fall colors. So this year, the trees were down, and even the ones that did not fall down had lost all their leaves. So there were no fall colors. It all looked more like winter. Maybe some low bushes might have had some colors. So among all the devastation, all the tree damage and the trails damaged and everything else that was affected, on top of that, we did not have the fall colors. Let's see. So those are excerpts of more children's work from a scrapbook that I found. There are books that use the storm as fiction devices, and as there's poems, there's picture collections, there's art, some of it pretty ominous looking. People started bringing chairs to my, let me show you this. Started bringing chairs to my presentations because these chairs were made with wood from the hurricane. Then a few years later, I went out of my way to try to find myself a chair. So I ended up buying this little rocking chair that has the same stamp. So I found some information about where the chairs came from, and I put it all on the book website. I have more information about the chairs. I have information about some discs that the city of Hartford gave us souvenirs, and all sorts of other items that I was able to come across. So the most important thing that I should make sure to mention before I go away is that it is inevitable that there will be another one like this one. Thankfully, hasn't happened in a very long time, and hopefully it will not happen anytime soon. When it does happen, some things will be worse. There's more people, there's more infrastructure, more costlier construction and things like that. But some things will be a lot better. Like, for example, forecasting, it will not take us by surprise. We will know the storm is coming. Emergency management, both before a storm and after, is evolved quite a lot since, and in great part because of this hurricane. And many of the worst case scenario damages that we learned to expect in this region are because of this storm. So we'll be a lot better prepared, but it will probably be it will cost a lot more, but it will probably be a lot less deadly. So I was, as I mentioned a few times, I did publish a book on the storm, and I was lucky to be able to do that and to give many presentations. The book did win an award from the International Organization of Atmospheric Science Librarians, so I was very proud about that. And I'm just happy to talk about this storm anytime that that anybody asks me. And also, I am happy to be receiving more information about it a lot of times from the audiences of these talks. So I'm gonna stop here instead of giving a 2-hour talk. I think because it's been a while since I gave the last one, I gave you a lot more detail per slide than the last time I gave one of these talks. But I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody has.
Thank you, Lourdes. That was fantastic. I think everybody really enjoyed that. One of our attendees even said that perhaps we should do a sequel so that you could share more of your material. So.
I have so much that I can share. Yes.
Oh, it was wonderful. All right, so I am looking through the chat right now for some questions. I know we've gotten some. Let me just go back. All right, from Becky Moore. How do you compare the impacts on Vermont between the 1938 storm and Irene, especially along the rivers?
Okay, so Hurricane Irene obviously was extremely devastating in Vermont. And I would say that the effects of Irene in Vermont were very similar to the effects of the 38 hurricane in Vermont. The difference is that it happened everywhere, as opposed to mostly in Vermont and then some areas of New Hampshire. So we're talking about the widespread devastation versus one specific area affected. The winds were stronger. The amount of rain was probably more in some areas, but not in Vermont. In Vermont was the similar amount.
Good to know. Second question, given climate change, do you think we can expect stronger storms and more storms in New England?
So that's one of the most hotly debated topics among tropical meteorologists, because there are things you know. You know that the ocean is getting warmer, so that will lead to stronger storms. You know that the ocean levels are getting higher, so the storm surge will go further inland and higher. But there are also questions about the other parts that affect the hurricane development, like the wind shear. We expect there to be more wind shear. So it is possible that we will have less hurricanes, but those that form will be a lot stronger and even affect areas that are not used to it. So the answer is not very straightforward. It has a lot of nuance that has to do with the different aspects of the storm. But in very general terms, warmer oceans, stronger storms, higher storm surges for sure, and not just for hurricanes, but nor'easters and any other kind of storm that brings in waves to the coastal regions.
Awesome, thank you. Looking through the rest of the comments, we've got a second person who thinks a sequel would be a good idea, and just a nice comment, super presentation based on great research, love your passion.
Thank you.
From Woody, how much were the White Mountains impacted by landslides?
From what I recall in the reports I saw, it was thousands of landslides everywhere, and it all got mixed in there. So it was not just the landslide, but also the washing out of the bridges and the falling of the trees. So a lot of areas were blocked both by trees and landslides. It was very chaotic, and probably the reports we have are not very accurate because of that, because the access was so hard. But yeah, my recollection was thousands of landslides, also thousands of forest fires, because all those trees fell and dried out, the ones that did not survive. So extreme fire hazard. People were putting out fires all the time as well.
Next question from Christine. Are there ecological impacts from the storm that can be detected now or did not recover?
There are, and there were at the time. A lot of the ecosystems for the animals and plants were changed. A lot of the trees that went down were replaced by faster grown trees, for example, pine. A lot of times you can make core samples of trees in the region, and they all are just a year younger than when the hurricane happened. There are areas, if you know what you're looking for, where you can detect what's called pit and mound topography, where the trees fell and the roots came up and brought the ground, the dirt with them. So they leave a hole, and then that matter kind of settles. So you end up with a hole or an indentation of the ground, and then a little mound right next to it. So there are signs about it. Of course, the forest always recovers if you let it. So, but there are signs still around if you know what to look for.
Thank you. Yeah, and we had a nice comment from Judy and Eric. So that you can still see evidence of the 1838 storm, and Tom Wessels has done work on this. And maybe if you send me that, there's a link or something, Eric, that would be great. I can share that tomorrow. How about we make this next question the last one? Lots of really great comments. This is a good follow-up. Has anyone ever estimated how many animals were affected?
Oof. So the Red Cross report had counts of chickens and cows and apple trees, by the way. So they focused on farming in animals and trees that were used for income, and then they focused on the timber. But there's no reports that I'm aware of how it affected wildlife, which I am very sure it was highly affected because a lot of the habitats were affected. But I haven't seen any specific reports about it. There was a hunting magazine that talked about the problems hunting because the deer could hide under all the fallen trees. It was a lot easier, a lot harder to see them. But I do not have any knowledge of more specifics than that.
All right, thank you, Lourdes. I think that'll be the last question.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. You know, weather's always a particular topic of interest. It seems like particularly to New Englanders to me, you've given us a lot to think about. There's so much more to a hurricane than just wind.
And there's so much more I could tell you about 10 hours worth, as I said.
Sequel. We definitely need that sequel. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Our next Mountain Voices presentation will be Professor Lisa Donor, who will talk about New Hampshire's changing lakes. That presentation will be on November 18th at 7 p.m. Please share this information with your friends. We look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you.